Now, part of the point of this series I'm doing here about the philosophy of the World of Darkness games is not to be attempting to portray any sort of authorial intent. I'm going for what I pull out of the material, less so much what people like Mark Reinhagen or Bill Bridges, had intended or even were aware. There's a phenomenon that occurs in art from time to time where the artist isn't entirely aware of what it is they're making, which is in part why I've always defaulted to the philosophy of death of the author. Author intent certainly has its factor to play in things, but once the piece has been released to the public, how the public interacts with it is somewhat out of the author's control. I feel like a good modern day example is the whole phenomenon of how terms like the red pill and other aspects of the Matrix movies have been adopted by popular culture that kind of run, against the intentions of how the authors of those films wanted those terms to be framed, so to say. However, in regards to my thoughts on Werewolf the Apocalypse, it's not entirely outside of the realm that some of the stuff that I'm going to say might have been in the mind of Bill Bridges and some of the other writers who worked on the project over the years. There are certainly aspects of the setting that hint at kind of my own interpretation of it. However, at no point do I ever remember it really being clearly spelled out in these terms. So, like I said, this is not me speaking as to what, like, any sort of official lore is supposed to be about what any of this stuff means. This is just what I feel you can kind of read it as meaning. Now, Werewolf the Apocalypse, on the surface, I played it a lot back in the day, back in the 90s, so, I myself, interacted with other people who are into werewolf and such, and it was a much more eclectic of a crowd than I believe Stereotype would present. There certainly were some kind of oddball fellows who were attracted to it, and there is kind of an aspect to the White Wolf games that in some ways they themselves attract the kinds of personality archetypes to play the games as you would find amongst the creatures that are in the games. And so to a certain degree, I kind of feel like some of the point of Werewolf was a little bit missed by a lot of its own player base. Even myself at the time, I would say. I mean, a lot of this is, me like looking back on these materials from an older, wiser perspective and all that kind of stuff. Werewolf is a game about rage. Now, what is rage? What makes rage different from emotions like anger or hate? Rage is a primordial reactionary kind of feeling, one driven from deep despair and threat of some sort of imminent catastrophe. These are the sorts of circumstances that will typically bring rage out of a person. Rage is a last defense, a last burst of furious energy to try to get yourself out of whatever terrible, terrible situation you might find yourself in. Even if in some cases with humans, because of our complex thinking, we will sometimes manufacture the illusion of being in one of those situations, therefore triggering a rage reaction, when in reality there actually isn't really the real environmental pressures that would necessitate such a reaction. But werewolves are all about rage. It's a core, component of what makes a werewolf, a Geru in Werewolf the Apocalypse. And what does that kind of really say about what's going on with them? I think, in many ways, the werewolves are actually the root problem in the World of Darkness, going by their own internal mythology of themselves. There is a bit of a problem with all the World of Darkness games, in that towards the end of the run, Exalted came out and created like this mythic universalized past that hints that it's from where all the various World of Darkness grew, back in a almost Middle Earth kind of setting where, like, before the world was round and fully complete, there was this kind of like timeless every world, all peoples kind of zone that was like laid out by like the four elements, and you can kind of travel infinitely off to the horizon where just eventually it's just nothing but sea or nothing but forest or nothing but fire and so on and so forth. However, in Werewolf, a lot of the changing breeds and the werewolves themselves have deep memories that go like way predate modern human history, which is not necessarily entirely legendary, considering the fact that werewolves do have the thing where, like, unlike a lot of people in the world whose spiritual beliefs are at some point a bit of a leap of faith, werewolves are able to physically enter the spirit world and interact with these things, including their ancestor spirits. And so their ability to have knowledge transmitted to modern generations from the past is much more theoretically reliable than, what, say, humans are able to do with writing and, oral histories and all that kind of stuff. The werewolves are arrogant. They have self-appointed themselves to be the guardians of Gaia. They self-appointed themselves to be, the colors of the early human population with their Impergium. And I feel like there's probably a pretty good, strong contention to be made that had the Geru not terrorized early primitive humanity so much, humanity would not have turned so hard against nature, therefore leading up to the modern day situation where the Gaian spirit that the werewolves revere so much seems under imminent threat. Also, the reactionary nature of rage and how that's caused the werewolves to operate has led to things like, the War of Rage, where they attacked and tried to wipe out the other shapeshifters because they didn't think they were doing enough to do their duty to help protect Gaia and all that kind of stuff. And even including at points taking out some of their own fellow werewolf tribes, largely because of paranoia and reacting to things, not really thinking things through. The werewolves assume that Gaia, condones their actions. They also assume that the worm is the problem. The spiritual world of werewolf and also of the greater, White Wolf World of Darkness setting does not present like a monotheistic view of a spiritual hierarchy. The spirit of Gaia is a relatively minor god. Not a tiny little spirit, but it's like maybe a second or third tier entity. But the top tier entities is the triad. So instead of a monotheistic, omni-being or a dualistic omni-being, instead of having a yin-yang balance between forces in the universe, what White Wolf has is a trinity of forces that balance each other. You have the wild, which is the raw force of creation, raw, limitless, untapped potential. Now you have the weaver, which takes the materials created by the wild and then gives them form and structure. And then the worm is what destroys these things when their time comes and creates the whole, like, circle of life, Simba kind of shit going on. Now, part of the crux of the problem as found in the modern world in terms of what sort of like spiritual malaise envelops all of creation in the setting is that the Trinity is broken. The werewolves think it's the worm that's the problem, but in reality it's the weaver. The weaver has corrupted the worm and driven it insane and is using the worm as a recycling device so that it could refresh materials that it can go ahead and then restructure and reorder in its ongoing quest to, try to, create a perfectly balanced, perfected universe. And the wild is the part that's being cut off. The wild does not threaten the worm. The wild threatens the weaver, because every time the weaver gets everything set up the way it wants, the wild introduces new, raw, formless chaos, and the weaver doesn't like that. And so weaver, by enslaving the worm, is, as I said, trying to cut out the wild and starve it out of the system, because the worm itself could just be, the recycling part, and it can just directly recycle what the worm destroys, as opposed to having to constantly bring in this new influx of material. That is the real breakdown of the spiritual triangle and why things are off balance and inverted. But because the werewolves are reactionary creatures, all they see is the worm and manifestations of the worm and worm's servants, worms, Fomori, Banes, all that kind of stuff. They're the ones that are doing the direct damage that they can visibly see. And so they're throwing themselves against the worm and its forces kind of single-mindedly, and kind of are blind to the fact that really they're responsible for the apocalypse, kind of in the end. Having not ever read the final Apocalypse book they put out, like I imagine it was probably written in such a way that you kind of have some variables of exactly how you want to resolve it within the book, would be my guess. I don't think they should win at all. I think that in the end, the werewolves should be hamstrung by the fact that their previous mistakes have put them in this situation. In particular, the chastisement of the other changing breeds, so that even their survivors, they're not likely to want to show up and have the Garus back there at whatever final fight against the forces of the worm there is. And that might be the critical flaw. They were not intended. There's a reason why we have all these different kinds of shapeshifters. It wasn't just all supposed to be werewolves. But their inability to see that this is their fault, because they're just angry and just constantly pushing against these things that are only pushing back against them because of their earlier actions, kind of stuff. And so insofar that there's lessons there to be found, I feel like obviously just basic human behavior is kind of a lesson to be learned from that whole kind of framing of what the werewolves are. That we must be cautious about reacting with blind rage, and we must learn to understand that the situation we find ourselves in globally in a lot of different ways is all based on a very long and ancient chain of events that we're kind of blind to our responsibility points to. We might acknowledge a few things were errors, but even then, we have kind of well, just get over it, guys, kind of attitude. And that leads us so that, if there's some sort of end times confrontation, the Garu are going to be left standing on their own because they've alienated everyone who otherwise might have been there to help them at the end. So, hopefully we ourselves could learn the maturity to discover our own version of that in the real world, and try to address it in a way that actually leaves us whole again, and no longer angry at ourselves. To what degree is the rage the creation of their own actions and not a reaction? Werewolves want to think of themselves as Gaia's immune system, but in a way they're are they more Gaia's cancer? Are they the cellular agitation that's gone out of control and has been destabilizing the system? They're the thing that destabilized the system, because no one appointed them king. No one told them to attack and harass humanity so much that even the sheer sight of the creatures drives us nuts and makes us forever afraid and fearful and feeling detached from the natural world from which we emerged in. Within the fictional universe of the World of Darkness, werewolves have had a tremendous impact on the mass of apathetic humanity that, in the modern day part of the setting, other factions such as, mages and changelings and such, might mock and lament the apathy of the masses. But the werewolves are arguably the thing that put humanity on that path where they just want to blind themselves to the harsher truths of reality and just, live their cozy little hedonistic, power-mongering lives, ignorant of the dark forces that pull our strings, because it's easier. So I guess that's about it for my philosophy of the World of Darkness, Part 2, The Apocalypse of Rage. Be sure to leave comments below, hit like and subscribe, and tomorrow we will be talking about the Ascension.